Welcome everyone to Automation Hour. This is our 91st Automation Hour. Now let me get this into slide mode. All right. All right, so if you're joining us for the first time, all lines are muted. Please post your question to our Trailblazer community, Salesforce Automation Hour. We will be posting a link to the recording as well as the deck sometime after the session, and that will be available on our website, Salesforce Automation Hour. So that's automationhour.com. Also will be posted out on the Trailblazer community, that's Salesforce Automation Hour, as well as Twitter too. And if you haven't signed up for our sessions, we are fully booked out for the rest of the year. So we have some really great guests, some repeat presenters, NVPs, really people in the community who are passionate about automation. And I want to call out especially the October 23rd session because our own co-host Rakesh will be coming back to present. So sign up for those, even if you can't attend. You'll get a link letting you know that the recording is available after the fact. And we need to give a shout out to our sponsor, Concrete.io. Without them, we cannot bring you this free webinar series. So thank you for continuing to support us. And here are your co-hosts, David Litton, Rakesh, and myself. And this was from last year's Midwest Dreamin'. So hope to see you all when we're able to see each other in person again. And with that, I'm really excited to turn this over to Eric. Eric is a new MVP as of this year, and he's done a lot of cool work out in the community. You probably, if you've been on the unofficial SF, you might have installed components that Eric has put together. So with that, let me hand it over to Eric. And you should have control.
Thank you, Jen. Okay, I think we have the slide up. As I mentioned, I am a new MVP, also a Lightning champion. I'm the Director of Software Development at a telecommunications company in Biddeford, Maine called GWI. I have 3 Salesforce certifications. I'm way behind Jen on my trailheads, but I have gotten over 200 badges so far. I have my own blog, Eric's Playground, at WordPress.com. I've been a presenter before, last year at Dreamforce, the last couple of Northeast streamings, Automation Hour, and numerous Salesforce users groups. As Jen mentioned, I have a lot of content on unofficialsf.com. I'm an advocate for open source and making things that can be useful for other people to help them in their own orgs. And my LinkedIn and Twitter links are on the slide as well. What I want to talk about today is an automation case that I put together a while back in my org to handle case assignments. Fairly simple thing, but I wanted something that would be fairly easy to use for all of the users in my org. And we use Service Cloud, we use cases at GWI, and not only for supporting our customers, but also for our internal ticketing queues. And we've set up different record types for the various departments that we have, and they each can process their own cases. I've got about 11 record types out there now, and I wanted to have some automation on just how people in those various departments could interact with the cases that were assigned to them. So I created 3 buttons. One is take, which allows somebody to go onto a case and say, I'm going to take this one. They click on take and it reassigns the case to them. You could also use an assign button to assign a case to somebody else on your team. And finally, a transfer button in case a case was created for one department, but really should have been sent to another one, you can transfer the case to the other department. And what I'd like to do before I show you how I did this is actually go into a quick demo and show you how this actually works. So here I'm looking at a case record in my org, and if we look in the chatter feed, we'll see my three buttons: take, assign, and transfer. Now, one thing you notice, this is a little different than what you see on most objects. This is kind of a remnant of the way things used to be in the Service Cloud and with cases, in that they put certain buttons in the chatter feed and other buttons appear at the top of the page like you would normally see with any other object. If you want to ask me why, I can tell you I don't know, because I really don't know why they do it this way. But this is where the buttons appear. So if on this particular case it was assigned to software development, if I go in, I'm looking at this, it's the case owner is the queue. I say, oh, I can take this, I want to work on it. So all I have to do is click the take button, and the system runs a flow that just gives a reassurance prompt here saying the case is reassigned to Eric Smith. I click next, and if you look over on the right-hand side for case information, as soon as that flow is done processing, it's going to change the case owner from software development to me. So that's really all there is to it. It changed the case owner. It also changed the status from new to open. Say, okay, you've taken it. It's not a new case anymore. It's an open case. You're going to be working on it. So that one button just makes those changes, and then you can move on. Let's say, for example, this case really wasn't for the software development team. Let's say I said, gee, the people in IT should be handling this. So I can click on the transfer button, and that just displays a simple pick list showing, oh, here are the other queues of the other departments that we can reassign this case to. So I say, well, we're going to send this one over to IT. So I just transfer it to them. So it'll change the case owner. It's now changed from software development, or me, it's now changed to IT. Let's take a look at another case, or another example. Let's say I wanted to assign the case to somebody else on my team. And this is where the automation comes into play, because I needed to teach the system how to pick all of the people that are on my team, or on anybody's team. So if I click on the assign button, there's my team. It's a cute bunch of folks. And so it displays the picture from the user profile, and I can go in and I can pick whoever I want to assign it to on my team. I click their image, and it will go and reassign the case to that individual. And there we go. That was reassigned to Emily. So that's how those three buttons work. Just to show you one more example, I'm going to go to an IT case. I'm going to click on that same assign button just to show you that depending upon what department I'm in, or what department that case is in, it's going to display a different set of users depending upon that case type. So here are the folks that work in the IT department. They're all a little crazy, but it's probably the same way in most of your companies. So we'll give this one to Albert and let him take care of that case. So that's basically it for the demo. Now I just want to go through and show you how the particular components were set up to do this. So I'm going to switch back over to my slides here. And I'm going to start with the buttons. There were three buttons: the take, the assign, and the transfer. And each of those buttons is a quick action on the case object that runs a flow. So in this example here, the assign button runs a flow called case button assign. And there's a different little flow for the take button, and a different one for the transfer button. The buttons themselves I put on the record detail page In the mobile and lightning actions, once those buttons are created, I drag them down to the custom buttons, and magically they'll show up in the chatter feed area on the case page. Now the flows itself that runs, those three flows are as simple as this. I click the button, and the flow runs an action which says, give me the ID of the case that you're on right now, because I want to pass that on further down the line. And then the second node in my flow is to run what's called a subflow, which is a whole other flow or a set of instructions that you can use. And the reason I use subflows here is basically trying to use building blocks when I set up my automation. I didn't want to have to do a complete flow for the take button, a whole separate flow for the assign button, another one for the transfer button. I wanted one flow that could do it all, so I set it up as a subflow, and I just have three little flows to kick that off. And the little flows just get the ID, they pass that ID on to the subflow and say, I'm the take button, here's the case ID, or I'm the assign button, here's the case ID, and so on. The get case ID action, all it's doing there in this little flow is it's just setting that ID to a variable. And here's here's where we call the subflow, and basically I'm saying here's the button, here's the ID, and we move on. But the subflow itself, look, it's a little more complicated. But in this flow, I have multiple paths that come in, and I'll take you through that as to what each of these does. In the beginning of the flow, I basically am doing two things. I'm getting the fields from the case record. I pass in the case ID, so I do a get records. I open up the case, I get the fields I need, and then I move on to a decision element that says, what did you tell me the button was that you pressed? And based on that button, I can either go to the transfer part of the flow, the assign part of the flow, or the take part of the flow. There was a fourth button I'm not going to go over today, but we also added an acknowledge button, which is similar to the take button, only it opens up another quick action on the page to allow the user to fill in a few of the fields at the same time they're taking the case. But that's what the beginning of the flow does. It says, okay, here's my record, and now how do I want to branch further on? The take button, once we decided that it's a take button, we have an assignment element, and we have a screen for the confirmation. The assignment element sets the case owner. It changes the case owner to the current user. Whoever was running the flow when they pressed the take button is the user that this ends up getting assigned to. And then you also notice I changed the status to open. Getting the user, it's a simple little formula you can use in a flow, and it's $user.id. That will return the ID of whoever it is that's running the flow at that time. So that value is always available to you. The screen that displays just that prompt that says, hey, the case was reassigned to, I have another formula there for the username, and it's using that same $user, only this time I'm picking up the first name and the last name and just displaying that on the confirmation screen. The transfer button, I showed you a pick list. And a pick list in a flow is basically, it's a list of choices that you can make. And my pick list has a choice starting with just a prompt that says select a new owner, and then I list all of the individual departments that this could be transferred to. And right after I make that selection with that pick list, I have a decision element that says, hey, is the person they selected still the prompt that said select new owner? If it is, go back and wait for them to actually select somebody different. Otherwise, we move on and we again update the fields on the case record to set the owner to a new department. And that's all we really have to do there for transfer. Now the assign button is where it gets a little more interesting. On the assign button, I have another subflow where I've taken a bit of processing and separated it out from this flow. And the first thing I want to do is I want to find out who is the manager of the person who's running the flow. So I'm picking up who is the manager of the owner of the case, and it's using a simple formula or function using the case function, which says if it's the software development queue, then the manager is the director of software development. If it's IT, it's a director of IT, and so on down the list. And you'll notice here there's no actual names of individuals, and there's no actual record IDs. Nothing is hard-coded in this subflow. And I'm able to do that because each of those directors or VPs or managers is nothing more than a public group. And so that's the name of the public group, and the public group just has a single individual or user in it. For example, the director of software development, that's me, has one user in the group, and I put it in there. So if this position ever changes and somebody else takes over that role, we don't have to go back in and edit the flow or the subflow. We don't have to change names, change IDs. We just go into the public group, the director of software development, and change who the user is. So it's a much simpler way of maintaining this type of automation. The other thing we needed to find out is, well, once we know who the manager is for that department or queue, how do we know who the individuals are that we could assign the case to? And to do that, I used a standard field that's part of every user's record, and that's the manager. So when you set up a user, you can also link or do a lookup for that user to another user who is their manager. And this is what I use in my flow to determine who all of the people are that report to that same manager that I want. And that determines the list of faces that I display there to select from. And so in the flow where I get that, I do a get records, where I get all of the employees that report to that manager, who I just figured out who the manager was, and I get those records, and from those records, I just want a few bits of information. I want the ID, the name of the person, and the URL to that photo, so I can display their photo. So I get all that information in a collection. I want to put the manager on there as well, because sometimes when you're reassigning something, it's not just the people who report to that person, maybe the person who heads up that group could work the case as well. So I add that, the manager's information, that same information, to the collection as well. So we just add that with the whatever came in from the previous get records to get the manager, gets added to the collection we created. And then I pass that information to my subflow, which is the flow that selects the user. So I pass the collection through, and coming back from that collection is going to give me the ID of who did the user select. So that subflow it's a fairly simple flow as well. It uses 3 apex actions. Actually, it's the same action from unofficialsf.com, which takes a collection of fields and creates a string out of it, because that's just what the next component is looking for. It's looking for a string, not a collection. So I convert the data, and then I pass it into a screen. And in the screen, it's actually, all of the screen does is it runs a Lightning component, a Lightning Web component that I wrote that displays those images and lets you click on one and select it. And that component just passes back the ID. So once I have that information sent back to me, I just like the other paths, I just update who the owner is with the whoever the ID of the selected user is, and I change the status to new. In case somebody had taken one, you reassign one. It then becomes a new case until somebody actually opens it and starts working with it. And then once any one of these three paths has updated the case record, that's all we're really doing is we're updating the case record. We did it one of three different ways. And then once we all paths lead back to my update records statement here, which just says now update the case with those new field values. So it updates the case, and then it makes a decision. It says, do I need to send an email out to tell somebody that the case was assigned to them? Well, this just checks to make sure if you click the take button, you really don't need to send yourself an email. So it bypasses the email step if you click the take button. Otherwise, it'll send an email out to whoever the case was assigned to. And finally, the last component, this is another, the last component is another component from Unofficial SF, which is the navigate component. And basically what this does is I'm telling the flow that when you're all done, go to the case page. And by telling the flow to do that, it refreshes the page for me. So whatever changes were made to the case get displayed on that page when you're done with the flow. So you don't have to manually refresh the page. So that's the flow. Buttons that get passed into a subflow takes three different paths depending upon what button I pressed. The case gets updated, somebody gets notified, and we're done. So be glad to answer any questions, either about this particular automation or anything to do with flows or automation in general, and glad to try and answer questions for you. Thank you.
All right, just a reminder, if you have any questions, you can post that out on our Trailblazer Community Salesforce Automation Hour. We do have a few questions, so we'll tick through those. We have a couple from Ruth, who is a fan of yours, and she really likes the image menu for assigning users to a case. So her question is, why do we use a button and next versus just take and the flow finishes?
Two reasons for that. One is I didn't want somebody to inadvertently click a button at that point and have something happen without them knowing it. And the other reason, in fact, I didn't do this on the assign, and I could have done it on the assign, is when you get into creating automations in Salesforce, one of the things you want to keep in mind is adaptive technology. So you may have people that use sticky keys or they use some other device to interact with the screen. And one of the things that they stress that you don't do is a lot of automatic actions. You should always give somebody the ability to do an action, interact with the screen, and then confirm it. And it just has to do with accessibility and adaptability and how you design your interfaces. But I could have done it. I could have just had the take button, move on, and not stop with a confirmation.
All right, and Ruth says that makes sense. And another question from Ruth is, can I put the button in the upper right corner actions button instead of the chatter publisher?
I wish. No. Someday I think Salesforce will fix that, but it is a strange thing that really only applies to the case object, and that certain interactions and certain actions on a case appear in the chatter feed and not where the rest of the action buttons go. If this was done with any other type of object or a custom object or anything else, they would all be in the upper right.
Yeah, the only way that I've worked around this is to create custom buttons instead of a quick action, just to get it to appear up on the corner there, but yeah, I
Yep.
don't understand the logic.
Right.
Um,
But
and
it's a training issue too with your users. Once they're used to seeing it in one particular place, you're usually good to go at that point. So
yeah, Susanna asks, why not just click the change owner button?
absolutely, you could click the change owner button, but that's basically the reason for doing this was to take some of the native way that you interact with Salesforce, where you go in and pick an individual field to edit and make those edits. This is a way of creating some automation that's presented a little differently. Um, and for example, on the take button, it doesn't just change the owner to the person who's taking it. It also changes the case status from new to open. So it's taking care of two updates instead of just one with one button.
Mhm. All right, let me check on the community, but also if any folks have questions on Eric's presentation or a general process automation question, you can pose that there. Well, while we wait to see if anyone's actively typing, oh, we got one question in. Is Flow slowly taking over automations from Process Builder? What are your thoughts on that,
It
Eric?
it absolutely is. When I first started working with Salesforce, I had a lot of workflows. Was able to convert, I think, all but one of them to at the time to process builders and flows. I think I had one that wanted to look at the is clone function, which was only available there. But flows are going to be taking over what process builder is doing, because really a process builder is a flow behind the scenes.
Mhm.
And the automation team at Salesforce is making great strides towards trying to get uh, trying to level the playing field between process builders and flows by adding additional capability to flow. We're seeing before save triggers, after save triggers. I think in the next few releases, we're going to see some automated formatting and creation of how all of the different segments link together. They're really doing a lot of things to bring this along. In fact, at some point in time in the future, you're probably going to see all of the approvals. That is a whole other process in Salesforce. All move over to Flow as well. So that really is the direction that Salesforce is going. Everything is moving towards Flow. Process builders won't go away, but they won't really change from what you see there today. But we will reach the point where Flow can do everything the process builder can do.
Yep, and that's the message that John Kucera, who was on our last automation hour, really enforced. So I would recommend, if you didn't catch that you go to our YouTube channel and watch that session on
I highly
December
recommend
20.
that as well. He did a great job last week and very helpful information. So yeah, if
Yeah,
you
and
didn't
he also
sit in live, go ahead and check the recording.
yeah, and he also highlighted some of the near-term roadmap items that will be hitting or are scheduled to hit winter and spring 21.
And I think also one of the things that we'll see someday is an automated way of taking existing process builders and turning them into flows.
Mhm.
I had actually experimented with that a few years ago, and with some pretty good success, not 100%, but I know there's people on the automation team working on that functionality right now. So at some point, even the process builders that you built and are using today, eventually they'll be turned into a flow for you, so you can continue to work with them.
Okay, Jason asks, have your users asked for there to be one step if they need to assign the case to a user in a different department instead of first transferring it and then assigning it?
No, they haven't asked for that because some of the departments use assignment rules. So depending upon the type of case, when it comes in, certain things might happen once it gets set to that particular queue. So for that, no, they haven't asked for it, but that's another reason why I didn't put that capability in. You can always assign it to a department and then go in and assign it to a user in that department as two steps if you need to.
All right. Wade says, thanks for sharing, Eric. Quick question. How do you handle a loop within a loop when you run across that? For example, I have the need to send a weekly email to every sales rep with a list of that sales rep's leads that haven't been touched in 14 days.
Well, if you don't have a lot of sales reps and a lot of leads, you might just get away with it. Because what you're doing is you're looping through your sales reps, and then once you have one sales rep, then you have to loop through all of the leads to get the ones that are there. It does make it tricky putting loops inside of loops when you do that. So really the only other way around that, and I've had to do this at certain times, is to make a call out to Apex where you can do some bulkification and return the data, from Apex back to the flow, which can then send the email. But if you're not able to write Apex yourself, you need to get a developer involved, and it becomes a lot more complex. So hopefully with a small number of leads and a small number of users, you might squeak by.
Okay, Ruth asks, Eric, how about one process builder per object? I find this very hard. Any suggestions on how to tackle that? It's just the right order to ensure I can end or next as needed and in an order that makes sense.
I think it's very valuable to have one process builder per object. The object that I have the most of my automation on is my opportunity object. And I probably have 12 to 14 process builders on opportunity, but only one of them runs when the opportunity record is updated. The other ones are all invocable process builders. So that can really help get you down to one process builder per object by creating some building blocks, creating some invocable process builders that do certain types of things, and then call those from the master process builder that you have controlling that object. And that allows you to really put things in the order you want to put them in as well. So create invocable process builders. I know it's a pain if you already have your process builders all built, because you got to build them all over again to make them invocable.
That's what we have at our company as well.
Yeah. And if Process Builder wasn't going away, I had another project that I was quite a ways into, which was to convert a regular Process Builder to an invocable Process Builder. So it would do it for you, but I'm going to wait and see if the demand's really there to do that. So.
All right, next one is from Terry. Eric, I've reached out to you earlier this week about the lookup component in communities. The lookup appears and the user is able to select an option, but then immediately disappears. The user selection is also not stored in the variable. I'm curious if anyone else has seen this behavior when used in a community.
I haven't done a lot of work with these in communities. I have done some of them in communities. What most often happens in a community when you run into this type of issue, it comes down to your object and field security and what the user might have access to. So if the flow runs, you might be able to do certain things, but as soon as you update a record or want to access a record that the user doesn't have access to, then they're not going to be able to continue. So that's one possibility that you may be looking at with communities is whether or not the user really has access to those records in those fields.
Just checking to see if there are any more questions. Ben just posted a comment. You can actually get a view of a process builder as a flow due to what I assume is a bug. If you have a custom field in a process builder, go to that fields page in Object Manager. Click on Where is this used button. From the list of results, you'll see a link to Process Builder under Reference Label. But clicking the link takes you to the Process Builder within the Flow interface. An interesting peek behind the scene curtain. Thanks for sharing that.
It is. I actually converted a process builder to a flow last year, where I actually started by doing that. But you've got to be careful because a lot of the things overlap each other on the screen, and the naming conventions are pretty bizarre. And to make it maintainable, you're probably going to need to rename everything that's in that process builder once it gets turned into a flow. So it can be a little tricky.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't guarantee that it'll work either once you bring something over. So.
All right. Again, if you have questions for Eric on his presentation or any general process automation question, please post that out on the community. So while we're waiting to see if anybody else has any questions, can you talk about a couple of the components that you've built on Unofficial SF for those of us who may have not gotten out on Unofficial SF or even know what Unofficial SF is?
Well, I'll tell you, it's a great website that has a lot of things you can use in flows, from very simple components to very, very complex. I did a presentation at Dreamforce on 10 different components from Unofficial SF, starting with some real simple ones. There's one out there that draws a line. That's all it does. But when you put it on a flow screen or you put it on a Lightning record page, I mean, you can really clean up and improve the interface that you're presenting to your users. There's some complex ones as well. Probably the two most widely used ones that I either developed or enhanced are the lookup component that allows parent-child relationships on a single flow screen, which is helpful where, for example, when you do a lookup on account and then you want to do a lookup on contacts, and it'll only show the contacts for the account you just selected. Things like that can be very helpful. The other one is data table, which is kind of like a list view in a flow, but it's very powerful in how you can present and work with data, and it's a great replacement for dynamic record choice, where you can really present the data in a much cleaner format for the user. You can select multiple records that you can then act on. You can edit and make changes while you're in the flow. I mean, there's a lot of things that you can do with the data table component. And then another one is a kind of like a pick list or a choice component called Quick Choice, which allows you to do radio buttons, check boxes, and actual visual boxes or display boxes, and use that kind of similar to what you saw when the pictures of the people I was selecting to assign a case to. That one has actually been elevated from Unofficial SF to the actual Lightning sample gallery with a number of other components for flows. So I would recommend going to unofficialsf.com to find a lot of information about flows, but also do a Google search on Salesforce sample gallery, and you'll see one of the sections there is a bunch of things that are called automation components. and they're already designed to work with your flows. They can be very, very helpful.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to using the updated version of that data table that works in Summer 20, because I really like being able to just use one component and just specify the object in the fields and have it just show up. So that's really cool.
Oh, it's that's going to make life so much easier for the admins that are putting this in their flows. One version for all your objects. I posted another utility this week on Unofficial SF that folks may want to look at, and that is uses the data table, but it presents list views of flows and process builders. Especially useful for process builder. It's a little better looking list view than you get with the native screen. But in addition to that, I put a time-saving feature in there, which is once that data table of all your flows or process builders is displayed, you can batch select inactive versions, press a button, and delete them all at once. I don't know if anybody's gone through and tried to delete more than one or two inactive process builders at a time, but it's a long slog to get through it. And this new utility, you display it once, select them all, and say, gone. So
all right, I'm
it's out there, it's
definitely
free.
need to check
Feel
that
free to
out,
use
Eric.
You have to put it in the sandbox for now because it does use the Summer 20 version of my data table.
I can just see that being a very popular component.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a time
Right,
saver.
we have a question from Ruth. Do you think it's possible to build a component to do a lookup on a website by passing a field to a page and presenting the results on a Lightning page? Example, passing a tracking number to UPS mobile track a package.
Yes, it's basically using what's called an API or application program interface, where a lot of websites have the ability to handle what's called an API call. So you create the request in your flow. Say, I want to send this request to the UPS site. You send it out, and it waits for a response. When the response comes back, you can then process that in your flow and present it on a screen or do any number of things. So there's a lot of good documentation out there on events, handling events, and using APIs with flows. But that will definitely allow you to do that.
All right, let's do a last call for questions. And while we wait, I do ask this question of several presenters. How did you get started learning Flow?
I got started learning Flow when Process Builder just wasn't doing enough for me. I said, I need a little more control. And I got to tell you, this was back before Trailhead and back in the old interface, and it wasn't easy. And probably the most common resource that I used to learn Flow was from both Eugen and Rakesh with the blogs that you have and the information you put out there. Really, I probably read every post both of you did, and that really helped me learn how to do different things in Flow. So thanks to both of you for helping me get started and get some of this stuff figured out.
Oh, thanks. I started when I first opened up Cloudflow Designer and saw the blank interface. I'm like, I don't know what to do, and I closed it immediately.
And then yeah.
And then
I'll have to twist my arm to come back to this.
There's just no real good documentation. Again, it was before Trailhead, right? It was just going to help in training, and I couldn't connect with any of the use cases that they had laid out for Flow. And I turned to my co-host Rakesh, and that's how I learned Flow, was Rakesh and Brian Kwong and Mark Ross at that time, and just going through their blogs and building it and understanding how it worked. And that's how I learned. So
I think the
definitely
biggest
kudos to the
hurdle
community.
to I think the biggest hurdle for somebody to overcome, and once they've done it, get past that point, it's much easier sailing from there, and that is finally figuring out and learning how to do a loop and update a record in a loop.
Hmm.
And once somebody is, I got a collection, I want to loop through, I want to make updates, and I want to save my updates. Once you've got that structure in a flow and figured that out, the rest just comes much easier.
Great. Yeah. But you do have to keep at it. So I'll say
Yes.
if you don't get it once, you don't get it twice, keep at it and you'll eventually get it.
Yep.
Persistent.
Yeah, and the community is very helpful as well. If you go to Automation Hours, the Trailblazer site, Salesforce Automation is another good one to ask questions about flow, and there's a lot of people there that are willing to try and help out, myself included.
Yep. And with that, I do not see any more questions. So I think we're going to close this call. Oh, we just had one question come in. Just snuck in. Could you create a flow and then try to recreate as another trigger or class?
You create a flow and then try and recreate. What was the rest of that?
As other trigger or class.
Another trigger or class in a flow. I'm not sure if I understand the question, Jen.
Okay, he posted a note. So could you create a flow and then try to recreate that into a class or trigger in order to learn Apex?
Oh,
Is that a way to learn Apex?
no. A flow can call out to Apex and do things with it, and Apex can feed information back into a flow, but they are two completely separate things to learn on their own.
I think if you're trying to learn Apex, a lot of the fundamentals that go into building a good flow would translate into good coding
Yes.
practices, such
Yep.
as when you're doing a loop, you don't do DML actions, things like that. Ultimately, when you build a flow, Salesforce translates that into Apex behind the scenes, but you don't really have access to that. So,
No.
but I know with my flow background, when I took the Rad Woman coding class, it was easier for me to understand the concepts of Apex because I already knew what a variable was, looping, and things like that. So it would make it
Yeah.
easier. But I don't know that you could just turn it into code.
Yeah, I wrote a new article today. There's a link for it when you go to the data table page on unofficialsf.com. I link out to um, some instructions on how to create an Apex defined class that you can use in your flow and then display in a data table. So that you might want to just look through that to see if it talks a little bit about flow, a little bit about Apex, and how the two can tie together.
All right, great. I think that's it, unless someone else has another question that they're going to put in there. Thanks again for Eric for presenting, coming back to Automation Hour and presenting, and we look forward to you coming back in the future.
I'd be glad to do it. It's a lot of fun, and hopefully people can learn from this and feel challenged enough to go try some of these things on their own.
Great.
Thank you.
And thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you in 2 weeks. Bye.
Bye-bye.